On this episode of China Uncensored, how the Chinese military's theft is costing America trillions of dollars a year. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. As I always say, good artists copy, great artists steal. Which means there's no greater artist than...
We sampled them from them, but it's not the same bass line.
Sorry, I was actually talking about...
economic espionage by members of the Chinese military.
Yes, the Chinese military. It's perhaps the world's most prolific and successful thief. Of course, the Chinese government denies it.
I want to stress that the Chinese government resolutely bans and cracks down on any form of hacking activity. This position is consistent and clear.
Right. The Chinese government cracks down on its own military. Anyway, by now it's widely known that
hackers associated with the Chinese government have repeatedly breached the computer systems of U.S. companies.
But how does that translate into actual profits for Chinese companies and losses for American ones? Introducing Technology Transfer Centers. As early as 2001, the Chinese Communist Party started building a systematic mechanism to not only steal intellectual property from foreign companies, but also to reverse engineer that technology and make it available to Chinese companies that then can use it to outcompete the same foreign companies they stole the technology from. Although this has been going on for more than a decade, it's only recently that we've understood the missing link of how this works. There are actually three pieces to China's nationwide system of economic theft. The first piece is the Chinese military. They hack, they spy, they steal, whatever it takes to obtain raw information like blueprints, data, trade secrets, and so on. The second piece is the transfer centers. They have trained experts process this raw information into step-by-step designs that are actually usable. The third piece is Chinese companies. Some of them are state-owned, some are private. Many of them are run by people with party or military connections. They get the designs from the transfer centers and use them to make Chinese versions of foreign products. Let me give you an analogy. It's the Iowa State Fair! And Grandma Chappell has won first prize for her famous apple pie. Now, folks from all over come to buy her delicious pastry. One day, she's in her kitchen baking when, by golly, she notices two Chinese tourists taking photos through the window. Well, shucks, they look friendly enough. The next day, these friendly folks stop by her pie stand and tell her how much they love her pie and that they'd just be tickled to take a few pies back home to their friends in China. Well, sure. Little does Grandma know what these two tourists are planning. They take her pies to the transfer center run by the Beijing New Oriental Culinary Institute, where they're analyzed by foreign-trained pastry chefs and reverse engineered into a step-by-step recipe. Then, the recipe is sold to a Chinese company. So, it's a year later, and Grandma Chappell is setting up her pie booth again at the Iowa State Fair. But this time, there's a new competitor, selling apple pies that taste almost the same, but for half the price. Poor Grandma can no longer compete. Obviously, this is just a made-up example. My grandma's from California, not Iowa. But this kind of thing really does happen. Like how in June 2011, employees of American Superconductor Corp discovered that their design for the computer chips that run wind turbines had been stolen. The company's biggest customer, China Sinovel Wind Group, had suddenly stopped using the American chips to run its turbines and instead began using knockoff ones based on the American source code. Since this theft also robbed American Superconductor of its biggest customer, it lost more than 80% of its stock value within 6 months. This kind of thing doesn't just happen sometimes, it happens constantly on a massive scale. In December 2007, the Chinese government literally wrote economic theft into its national economic plan. Back in June, I interviewed cyber espionage expert Joshua Phillip. Today, he published a groundbreaking article in the Epoch Times that for the first time reveals the scope of China's state-authorized technology transfer centers. Josh, thank you for joining me again to help me further undermine China. So, your article exposes these technology transfer centers. What's the big deal about them?
Right. So when people talk about Chinese cyber espionage, they often talk about the cyber attacks or the spies that steal the technology, or they mention vaguely that Chinese companies are profiting from this. The transfer centers are the place between the two of those that process the stolen technology from the military and then pass them to the relevant Chinese state-run industry.
So they're sort of the in-between that reverse engineers what is stolen.
Exactly. And the funny thing about them is they don't even try to hide it. If you read their doctrine, if you read what they even say about their companies, they call themselves China's National Technology Transfer Centers.
This is totally open.
Open, functioning through Chinese universities or under Chinese companies or with ties to the Chinese military. And nobody seems to talk about them. The technology transfer centers exist throughout the entire Chinese system. They exist in the military. They exist on the government side of the Chinese regime under the State Council. They exist under universities. They exist under businesses.
So this is an incredibly powerful organization you're talking about.
Well, it's not just an organization. This is something the CCP set up, something the CCP created, and then encouraged people to duplicate as a system that just permeates the entire Chinese economy as a way to steal and process stolen information. This is a system that is massively larger than what anyone today is thinking about when they talk about Chinese espionage for some reason.
It's crazy.
This is the missing link in understanding the Chinese system for economic theft. They have a step-by-step process for stealing information, for processing the information, and for drawing a profit from the stolen information.
How many Americans are being affected by this?
Well, this affects every American. This is something that not only affects U.S. innovation, that not only affects U.S. companies and taxpayers and services supported by taxes, it also affects our basic ability to innovate and to benefit from what we create.
In your article, you quote Casey Fleming, who's the chairman and CEO of Black Ops Partners Corporation, and he gives a number that this is costing the U.S. $5 trillion a year, which is about a third of the country's GDP. That's so much freaking money. How is that possible?
What Casey is talking about is the potential market value over a 10-year lifespan. So basically not just what information was stolen, but what value would that have had when it actually went to market. Across a 10-year span of market value, you're talking about $5 trillion a year.
So in that 10-year period, it would be about $5 trillion every year.
That's right. And he's looking not just at reported cases, which is where things get out of whack, because most companies don't want to report cyber attacks. Casey's looking at he's working with companies that have been victims and who don't report that they've been attacked because they don't want to cause their shareholders to freak out. They don't want to cause customers to freak out. They don't want to get their CEOs fired, which has happened to, I think, Target and quite a few other companies that have reported cyber attacks.
So it's basically blame the victim.
Yeah. So Casey is seeing a different side of this. He's seeing the number of cases that have not been reported. He's looking at cases of stolen technology that we don't know about.
So why don't we just hack China and steal their ideas?
Right. So there are some companies that have asked permission to launch counterattacks, and they've been told not to do so. It's because we are a country of laws, and we can't get away with that kind of stuff.
But this is something I hear a lot. What right does the U.S. have to criticize China for this? Isn't the U.S. the biggest cyber aggressor in the world?
U.S. spying is just spying. It's just listening to conversations. It's listening to high-level dialogue, and it's trying to analyze strategies and opinions on the West. It's trying to figure out, Are you planning to attack us? Are you really our friends? Are you plotting against us behind our backs? It's that kind of stuff. This is the kind of stuff that every spy organization in the world is engaged in. The stuff China is doing is that, in addition to actually stealing things from other countries, and then taking that stolen information and using it to undermine that country.
Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Thank you.
That was all really, really scary. I provided a link in the description below where you can read Josh's article. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. I'll see you next time.
They're part of what the US military would call hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is a way of fighting war against another country without using troop-on-troop combat.
You'd almost think Communist China and Democratic Taiwan were allies, until you saw this in Chinese state-run media. They appear to be liberating a building that looks suspiciously like Taiwan's presidential office building.